Today on Historia Nostra, it's part 2 of my interview with Dr. Ben Hoy from the University of Saskatchewan. If you haven't seen the first part of our conversation, you can find it at the link in the description. In this part, we're talking about modern board games that use historical theming or are built around historical events, the process of creating these games, and how they can be used to teach history. We'll start by talking about 2 examples. One Dr. Hoy considers good, and one he considers poor, and why.
So one of the interesting things about board games today is the region that they're created in actually will tell you a lot about the kinds of depictions that they may do. So this is Tanaka. This is a German-created game. It's available only in Germany, which when we sort of look at some of the cards will make some sense. But board games are really interesting in that the two dominant industries are sort of Germany and Europe and the United States. And in Germany and Europe, there is a strong fascination with indigenous people from North America that goes back to Karl May and some of these sort of early German novelists. But that's very different than, say, living in the United States, where you have a sort of direct relationship with indigenous people. And so the German games tend to be much more romantic, often quite a bit more offensive. So this is a game where you are trying to build these weirdly colored, weirdly shaped totem poles, where you have indigenous braves climbing up to claim indigenous squaws. So it's fairly offensive. It sort of blurs a bunch of different indigenous cultures together. It has a lot of sexualized imagery. It sort of, in some ways, represents the worst features of this kind of history. There's no real sort of historical merit. It's taking a bunch of the symbols that people associate with stereotypes and putting it into a card game that is essentially just playing cards, trying to sort of trump one another at the end. So very little history, lots of offensive imagery, and I think only possible in Germany. There's a reason this game hasn't been reprinted in the United States, because there's no way they would sell. So this is Freedom Underground Railway. It is a game about slavery and sort of the path towards freedom. So it's, as you can see, a much larger, much more complex game, much longer, much more historically rich game. You play as sort of omniscient players who can see the whole map, right? So in some ways, you have a lot more information than you'd ever have in any sort of historical environment. You can see all of a continent all at once. You're sort of orchestrating escapes. So all of the slaves in this game start at the bottom in the south, and throughout the game, you're trying to move people from the south all the way up into Canada. But as you can see, there's sort of these colored lines across the board where slave catchers are going to try and move. So it's a pretty interesting game in that, and very ahistorical in some ways, but in really interesting ways in others. So throughout this game, some of the safest places to be are actually in the American South, where there's very few slave catchers. And as you get closer in the north, there's often many more slave catchers, but the game sort of forces you to always be moving north. In order to free up space for new people to move onto the board, everyone has to be going north. So some of the mechanics are very ahistorical, like why would you want to stay in the American South? In fact, it's quite dangerous. But the sort of game mechanics as a whole is constantly pushing people up. And it's a really, really interesting game in that people play differently because of the theme. So I've played with a number of people who, the game gives you points for getting people to freedom, points for all different kinds of things. And I've played with many people who, under no circumstance, no matter which set of points makes more sense, will send people back into slavery. Right, so it has a very evocative theme. It is a very visceral theme. People play, like I said, this game very differently than they would other games, where you might sort of min-max points in a different game. In this game, people often sort of approach this from a moral point of view, and approach it very differently. Like many historical games, you don't get this sort of complexity of history. showing the differences between a sort of historic environment and the present day. That's very difficult. That requires a tremendous amount of nuance. It requires thinking about story. And that's where I think you need historians being brought in. And the trick is bringing them in early. Game makers are not good historians, and historians are often not good game makers. And you need some kind of partnership. It's not enough just for one to sort of go out and try and do the other's work.
Mm-hmm.
So when you do see that kind of partnership, I think you see the highest quality games. So, one of the things that I sort of like to do is think about, how can we make games better?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the sort of pieces that I've really struggled with teaching history is there are certain concepts that I can tell people about, but that they don't necessarily learn. So one of the biggest challenges that I ran into when I was starting to teach was I teach a lot about the border, I teach a lot about smuggling, and people understand it on sort of an academic level, but as they're reading these documents, they often pass moral judgment. Oh, these people are criminals, they were sort of outcasts in their community. All of these assumptions that we sort of bring from the modern day and sort of read back into history, they're actually quite wrong in the time periods and places I'm looking at. And I could tell them that, but as I was reading people's papers, as I was reading the responses, it was very clear that some of the key pieces of that history were just being lost in translation. And so I tried to build a game called Policing the Sound to deal with that, which you've played.
Yes, twice.
Twice. So the game is set around, almost everyone is playing as merchants. One team plays as the customs agent. And essentially every community has an option to either smuggle or not.
Mm-hmm.
And the customs agent will choose one of those people and they will search them. So it's a really, really simple game. Every community is different. Each of the resources is based on sort of archival documentation. But what's interesting is when you give everyone these sort of options, there's very little policing. Only one of the 8 communities gets searched at any one time. The rewards for smuggling are quite high. The punishments for it are quite low. As it turns out, almost everyone becomes a smuggler almost immediately. And partly it's the first round, very few people smuggle, but 1 or 2 people do. And it becomes immediately clear how beneficial that is. And suddenly the sort of whole social environment that people are operating in changes. And people feel competitive. And very quickly, everyone smuggles. I think I've had only one time where one person didn't smuggle over the dozens of times that I've played this game. And that's actually much closer to what the history looks like. The community doesn't agree with the rules that are being presented to them. And so you have this difference between what is legal and what is socially acceptable. And being able to experience that interactively, I think, conveys a lot of these lessons a lot better than just sort of telling someone the moral of the story. I think that's sort of the brilliance of games, is it's a lot easier to remember. If you can experience it, you can experience it on a much more nuanced level than just being told by some random professor that, oh, lots of people agreed with smuggling in the 19th century. You don't understand how it works. And so, especially complex games that can show you something that you couldn't just read in the rules or see in the pictures. That's, I think, the future of games in history, is really that sort of that core where you experience something through actually engaging with the game and seeing how other players move, seeing the system. The underlying system gives rewards and punishments depending on how you act. And that, I think, is the core of making a good historical game, is setting those so that people can see the sort of underlying argument that you're trying to make.
Board games can be valuable teaching tools that encourage players to think through and play out historical situations. The best historically based games bring experts in early in the game-making process, but because this adds expense and time to the production period, are still relatively rare. Games that incorporate historically based images or themes are much more common. Those that appropriate historical imagery without incorporating game mechanics or stories that also work into the chosen theme are, at best, simple games with little educational value, and, at worst, they misconstrue historical contexts or perpetuate racist motifs or stereotypes. If you'd like to learn more about Dr. Hoy's research, check out the sources in the description. Our theme music is by Broke for Free. You can learn more at brokeforfree.bandcamp.com.